Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for taking the time on this wet Bond Sunday afternoon to be with us in this nice, pleasant and comfortable, warm room. So my name's Matthew Reddy. I'm the Director for Climate Smart Agriculture with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And the title of this session today is around innovation in agriculture. How do we meet the NDCs for mitigation and those for adaptation through technological innovation? What might those barriers be? How can we overcome them? What's being done? What are the best opportunities? So it's my pleasure to introduce an expert panel this afternoon. I'll start with Dr. Bruce Campbell, the Director of the CGIAR Program for Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security, who'll be giving us perspectives on best bets for adaptation. We have from the Global Research Alliance for Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Emissions, Hayden Montgomery, the Special Representative, Clyde Graham, Senior Vice President with Fertiliser Canada, Chief Sustainability with Kellogg Company, Diane Holdorf, from Corporate Carbon in Australia, Matthew Warnken, who is the Managing Director of Corporate Carbon, from Yara International, the Head of Sustainability, Bernard Stormier, and Gabriella Burian, who is the Senior Director for Agriculture with Monsanto. So today's panel, we're going to run through some innovation ideas in adaptation and mitigation. We will be asking questions from the floor. So this is a nice small room. If you feel that you have a burning question that you'd like the group to address, this is a great forum to do that. There are a lot of myths around agriculture, and this is a great expert panel with whom to perhaps explore some of those as well, and to consider how you might take forward some of these options for adaptation and mitigation. So for the first speaker this afternoon, I'd like to introduce Bruce Campbell, who is going to provide us with some framing for our discussion today.
Great. So I'm going to talk about innovations in agriculture, and what we've done in the last few weeks is put together a booklet of 10 innovations which we really believe are ready to go. They're mostly in the adaptation space, but every one of them has mitigation co-benefits. So just as a bit of a background, as you know, essentially agriculture is really ready to go in terms of the negotiations, because almost every country that put in adaptation as part of its NDC has included agriculture. And on the mitigation side, the same thing has happened. In the NDCs, agriculture is part of the mitigation agendas of almost every country. So this is the publication that's come out, and there's postcards outside on the 10 innovations, and I'm going to go through some of them now. So the first one that we think is really important is agroforestry. It diversifies livelihoods and incomes. It's got amazing mitigation co-benefits, and it can also increase productivity both in the cropping system, but perhaps even significantly, for example, in East Africa, where the agroforestry is feeding into the livestock systems and improving productivity. Aquaculture, one predicts a massive surge in interest in aquaculture in the next decade in, for example, Africa. We really have to live up to that. And thinking about the diets for what that aquaculture is going to do. And once again, it's really important for diversifying incomes. Stress-tolerant varieties of a whole range of different crops. Enhanced resilience, ability to withstand drought, 40% more yields than traditional varieties, and greater nutrient efficiency if you manage them appropriately. Improved smallholder dairy. In terms of the livestock sector, we really see the dairy industry part of it as the the place which is ready to go. So once again, it's diversifying farming systems and incomes. In the East African situation, the big dairy companies are going after women farmers as well, so there's a big gender dimension to it. And by feed improvement, you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output as well. Alternate wetting and drying in rice systems. So this is really an Asian, something that's happening in Asia at the moment, but if you look at plans in terms of national governments in Africa, many of them have got rice on their agenda. This is alternate wetting and drying in rice. All you have to do is change the way you put water on rice, and you can reduce water consumption by up to 50%, which is an adaptation option, and you can reduce greenhouse gases by 25 to 50%, depending on the circumstances, without any productivity losses. Now, the rice sector has the same greenhouse gas emissions as the aviation sector, and if one can get a 25% reduction in emissions from the rice systems, that'll be incredible. Micro irrigation powered by solar. So there's estimates that there can be a 200% increase, or there needs to be a 200% increase in irrigation in Africa. Do we have to do it as business as usual in terms of large dams and those sorts of things? Or can we use alternate methods? The solar-powered irrigation is already happening in India at scale. It's a wonderful South-South learning event, a learning option. The farmers in the systems that are happening in Nepal and India are selling excess electricity to the national grid, and the irrigation is allowing them to increase their numbers of crops they can have per year. But what I get very nervous about when I present 10 options is that it sounds like there's some silver bullets out there, and essentially I don't really believe in silver bullets too much. So our vision is that there has to be an agricultural transformation in the next decade. And I would say that the systems that I know in Africa, for example, are going to be will be completely different from what we see today. So two of the key pieces of that are on this diagram. So one of the cornerstones is climate adapted and low emissions technologies. We have to put Africa on a different course than what happened in the developed world. We're on a low emissions course, so that's another key cornerstone. But part of it is climate advisory services. Because of the strange weather patterns, the Met services really have to change the way of business. They have to improve on their forecasting, and the forecasting has to get to farmers. So one of the 10 options that we think of is really important is climate-informed advisories. The next one is two-way extension. So as you know, the extension services are insufficient in terms of meeting farmers' needs, and we suspect, or we predict, that in a decade every farmer in Africa, for example, will have access to a cell phone. Digital agriculture and two-way extension is going to be feasible. I would say that farmers on a smallholder system will be able to type a question about a problem they have in their own field, and they'll get a tailored answer for their own field in a decade's time. So the next option that we highlight is digital agriculture. And there's so many of these things happening already in terms of perhaps small scale, but in some places it's already meeting, some companies are reaching 50,000 farmers, for example, in particular locations. Index-based insurance, because of the risk involved, we think it's another key to the cornerstone for transformation. So weather index-based insurance, there's already 500,000 people insured in sub-Saharan Africa with these kinds of products. They're amazing products where farmers can buy them on cell phones. They can get paid, they can pay their premiums through the cell phones, and they can get the money back as soon as there's a problem on the cell phones. This has to there's 500,000 now, but it has to reach tens of millions within a decade. Crucial to this, and this is why this panel is great, is the private sector. This is not going to happen with public money. It has to be public-private partnership. And one of the options that we look at is this whole blended finance, how public finance can de-risk startup operations and use the private sector's ability to get to scale. And then these are at the top of the last two. And they're not part of the 10, but they're absolutely crucial. We're wasting our time if the policy and framework is not right. So that you'll always have tiny little pilots and things, but we need to see government stepping up in terms of providing the enabling environment. And when I'm talking about policy, it's not agricultural policy. It may be policy related to the insurance sector, to the banking sector, to the mobile phone sector. That may be the most crucial to drive change. And at the very same time, we need real bottom-up strong organizations. Farmers' organizations have to demand services from the service providers. They have to be powerful enough to be able to deal with pricing and those sorts of things. Thanks, that's it. And just to say, there's one more event that you may want to go. It's on Tuesday, Agricultural Advantage, 5 minutes from the other Bullis zone.
Thanks very much indeed, Bruce. And we were just at the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture session before, and one of the presenters there, also from CCAFS, presented the case study of a woman's cooperative in Kenya using solar irrigation for drip irrigation, and they had a threefold yield increase in their production. So incredible opportunities that exist there in low carbon and productivity development. So we've looked at adaptation. Now we're going to look at perhaps the more talked about side of agriculture, and that's the mitigation options that are available. So I'd like to welcome to the from the floor, Hayden. What would you prefer? You can go from the floor or from the podium. Hayden Montgomery from the Global Research Alliance, and I would like to say that WBCSD and the Global Agribusiness Alliance are now members of the Global Research Alliance. Thank you, Hayden.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, before diving into the mitigation research agenda, I'll just give you a few words about the Global Research Alliance to make sure that you know a little bit about what the organisation that I represent. So probably organisation is the wrong word to start with. It's actually, as it says, an alliance of governments and public and private sector organisations. We have 49 governments that are members from all of the regions of the world, and we have almost 20 partner organisations from public and private sector, as I mentioned, and ranging from research providers like the CGIAR system through to development banks, multilateral, regional and bilateral development agencies. The basic mission of the GRA, for short, is to reduce greenhouse gases from food production. So when I talk about the work done by the GRA, I'm sort of, in the broadest sense, what I'm talking about is the research agenda of the members in an individual way, and also the collaborative work that we promote through the GRA as a forum to promote cooperation and research internationally. In terms of the research agenda, I just want to maybe spend a little bit of time talking about the characteristics of the work that we promote and the sort of pathway from discovery through to implementation. So when we talk about discovery phase research, we're talking about exploring promising concepts in the laboratory that could become candidates for future proof of concept work. When we talk about proof of concept, we're talking about a practice or a technology that has been demonstrated in the laboratory to have some potential that needs to be piloted in a field situation. Then we move to the pilot phase, and that is where, or the pilot stage research, where you've carried out a successful pilot in the field, and the next step is commercialization, so that you have a pathway to farmers. And of course that requires the involvement of, crucially, the private sector. And in the final stage we talk about best practice, and this is where you have a concept, a technology or a practice that has been commercialized, and the gap you're talking about is adoption, and how do you get that in widespread use in diverse contexts. In all cases and all stages of this innovation pathway, we're evaluating the greenhouse gas reduction potential to the extent you can do that at the discovery phase, but certainly as information becomes available, always considering whether this is a technology or practice that has huge potential for reductions or maybe marginal potential for reductions. Always evaluating the economic viability of this technology or practice, because ultimately it's the question of cost, and we need to make these things cost effective so that they will be adopted. And then of course the other trade-offs that may be a consequence of that technology and practice. Now trade-offs could be positive and negative, so there may be, as Bruce mentioned, yield advantages from certain technologies or practices, but there could also be the potential for yield penalties, so we need to be very sure when promoting certain technologies and practices, to know what the impacts will be for farmers. To give you a sense of the best practice sort of package of practices and technologies that we know take us in the right direction, that we know that can have a significant impact in emissions in terms of per unit of production. And in some cases, we're talking about a factor of 10. And this is data that's sort of real world examples. We're not talking theory here. And these are practices that are well known in an agricultural context. They may come from the adaptation agenda, as we heard earlier around managing water and rice systems, or having more well-adapted species of crops, etc. For drought resistance or whatever other trait you may be selecting for. We know, as I say, we know these practices take you in the right direction in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. We know there is the potential for very significant reductions per unit of product. These things are, I would characterize in some general categories. We could talk about health, so that could be animal health and plant health, and reducing the burden of disease in these systems can increase overall productivity, and if that reduces that yield penalty that can occur from an unhealthy plant or animal, that will have quite a significant impact in reducing greenhouse gases per unit of production. I guess the general category I would talk to next would be nutrition. So feeding animals adequately is often the most crucial intervention you can make in terms of reducing greenhouse gases from livestock systems. And the same applies to plants, ensuring correct plant nutrition through amendments to the soil and fertilisers, whether they be nitrogen or others. And I won't go into detail because we have a very qualified panel on fertilisers here. Water management, whether it be in a rice paddy situation or just generally in irrigation and agricultural systems to ensure maximum productivity possible in that given setting. Well-adapted species, which will be plants and animals, to ensure that the species you are choosing in a given context are able to cope with the conditions of that context. So you're not losing yield as a consequence of, say, heat stress or drought or other climatic or weather impacts. In terms of some specific technologies that would fall into the category of best practice, you could dive into, say, livestock sector. The capture and storage and utilisation of manure, we know, will reduce greenhouse gases. There's always a question of the quality of the implementation and ensuring that these systems are well managed, but we know that correctly managed, capturing waste to the extent you can in a livestock system, storing it well, and then utilising it for energy or maybe subsequent fertiliser use will have a positive effect in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. What we do need, though, so we know we're going in the right direction, but we do need improved ability to estimate and report and verify the emissions reductions that occur. Because once you achieve a certain level of productivity in these systems, you start to get into the territory of trade-offs. And it's really important to know what are the reductions that you are expecting from continuing to increase the efficiency, productivity, production of food, and understand whether those incremental gains are worth it if there are significant trade-offs in terms of, say, yield or other environmental or social or cost factors. If you talk about pilot stage research, there are things we know that have been shown in an experimental context to have a positive impact. And if I think about rice production, so water management clearly has a positive impact. But then there's a question of residue management and nutrient management in rice systems, and timing and what you do with those residues has a very important impact on the overall greenhouse gas balance of that rice system. And so there is knowledge about ways to manage residue in different settings. Another potential intervention could be the use of biochar, so maybe charring the residue and then incorporating that biochar into that system. But these are practices that we can't say, I think, hand on heart, we know have a significant or positive impact in all settings. So this is where we need to be piloting and scaling these up to really know for sure. In the discovery and proof of concept phase, I would sort of group it together. We have work going on in, say, livestock where there is the potential for vaccines to be produced that could actually reduce the methane production from the rumen of the animal. And this has been proven in an experimental context, and it's a question now of absolutely being sure that you have, or quantifying the impact of that technology, and then the commercialization of it, which, as you're probably well aware, for vaccines can be quite a number of years. Then you might have inhibitors, where you could add specific compounds to the diet that, in an experimental context, we have seen reductions of up to 90% of methane, which is absolutely enormous. The challenge there is taking that to scale and finding compounds that you can administer to animals as less frequently as possible, because every time you have to be in contact with animals, particularly in extensive systems, that adds cost and impracticality. So it's about getting the dosage as low as possible for those compounds. There is significant potential, again, at the sort of proof of concept or discovery phase around low emissions animals, where some animals just have fewer emissions coming from the rumen. And so there is now quite a significant program of work to try and identify the genetics of those animals, to identify the traits that are responsible for that low emission characteristic, and then can you find low cost, rapid detection technology so you can identify these traits in the population of livestock around the world, and then select and breed from those animals, of course considering the other production characteristics you want to breed for. And then finally, I guess in the same category around selection and breeding would be cultivars and rice production, where it has been shown, at least experimentally, that some cultivars of rice actually have lower methane emissions through the stem of the rice plant itself. So is that a potential avenue for taking that to scale and commercialization? I guess in all of these situations, you have, in some experimental situations, you have a very well-established pathway to adoption, and the challenge is providing the sufficient knowledge to show the proof of concept. So in the case of animal breeding, every animal is bred, right? Every animal is born. So the pathway to adoption is there. It's a question of whether we can identify the right animals to then incorporate into those breeding programs. So I don't want to say much more for now. I think that gives you a sense of the sort of research approach we're taking in the GRA. You can characterise it, I guess, into two camps. You're talking about productivity and driving productivity gains as much as possible and demonstrating the impact of that in greenhouse gases through good MRV systems. And then what you would put in the camp of, say, absolute reductions of greenhouse gases by innovative technologies and practices. And the reality is we need all of that. We can't rely alone on adoption of technologies and practices that increase productivity. We know, and work done by CCAFs, that takes us about between 20 to 40% of the way of the mitigation we need out of agriculture by 2030. So we need a dual strategy of adoption and scaling out of good practice, and we need significant investment in research and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayden. And I think the message that we're getting through the presentations on adaptation and mitigation is that there's a benefit to adaptation, a benefit to mitigation, and a benefit to production, which is in essence the message of climate-smart agriculture. So we'll take those mitigation and adaptation discussions forward now with some practical examples of what industry is doing. This is Industry Day, Industry 4.0. So I'd like to welcome Clyde Graham from Fertiliser Canada to explain what the fertiliser industry is doing, not just within Canada but globally, in the realm of climate smart agriculture.
So, there we go. Okay, green is go. I represent about 46 large fertilizer companies based in Canada or globally that operate in Canada. And the basic problem that we're dealing with is how do we get fertilizer use right? Because we don't want our products to be wasted. We want farmers to get the maximum benefit from every kilogram of fertilizer that they use. And that's important for all three things that Matthew mentioned. It's important for mitigating fertilizer or greenhouse gas, because if you use nitrogen fertilizer poorly, it does produce nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas. And we also need it for resilience, because resilient soils are fertile soils. And farmers that don't replace the nutrients that are taken up by the crop every year are going to face soil degradation long term. And I think lastly, in terms of adaptation, one thing that we probably haven't focused enough on is that we need to help farmers make good decisions about their fertilizer use, so as they adapt to changing climates and they use different varieties of crops, or they actually have to change to different kinds of crops, and they have to expand their rotations and use a different mix of crops and face all the kinds of challenges that they're going to face with climate change. And so we have to give them decision-making tools, and that word comes up a lot. And when you look at the basic agronomy, the science of growing crops, there are four key things when it comes to soil fertility and using fertilizer or manure in the soil. And we call it 4R nutrient stewardship. And the four basic concepts are: you have to get the right source of fertilizer, the right kind of fertilizer, and whether that's basic fertilizer compounds or whether you're using high technology fertilizer products that I think Bernard is going to talk about, you have to get that right. And then you have to get the rate of fertilizer right. You have to put on enough fertilizer that the plant will get the nutrition it needs, because fertilizer is simply food for plants, so that the plant can grow and give you the yield you're looking at, but not too much, so that the plant, it's not wasted and lost to the air in terms of nitrous oxide or other emissions. You also have to be careful about where you place the fertilizer. You need to get it in a position where the seed, as it grows and becomes a plant, and the roots can uptake the fertilizer and make the most of it. And again, so that most of the fertilizer ends up in the plant and not lost to the environment. And then timing is often overlooked as well. You have to be careful in Canada, for example, where we have winter and snow, to avoid putting a fertilizer on too late in the season or too early in the season, where runoff and weather can lose fertilizer. And often you can improve your efficiency in certain cropping systems by applying additional fertilizer during the course of the growing season, so that the plant gets the fertilizer at just the time it needs to grow faster. And all those things are important for mitigation and resilience and for adaptation. When we apply nitrogen fertilizer to crops, if we do it in the right way, if we use soil testing where that's available, or other systems for determining the crop fertility needs, where we get the rate and the source and the time also correct, we can reduce the emissions of N2O by 25 and even up to 50%. And that's a huge benefit for global warming. And I think that, as kind of Bruce referred to in terms of Africa and other places where there's huge potential for higher yields and greater productivity, and frankly, to make smallholder farmers profitable and able to provide for schools and for healthcare and all the basic needs that people need, they're going to be using more fertilizer, but we want them to use it as efficiently as possible so that they don't lose too much of that fertilizer to the environment and contribute to greenhouse gas. And so those are some of the key things. In terms of the technology, we think there are ways that we can reach farmers in a very efficient way. So the International Plant Nutrition Institute that we work with very closely has developed a nutrient expert program that allows farmers to get on their mobile devices the latest information about what kind of fertilizers they should be using for the very specific crop and climate that they have. And all that's based on scientific research that needs to be undertaken and is underway now to find out what are the basic agronomy needs in all the regions of the world. I think that it's a critically important part of all this that these decisions have to be locally based. That every farm and field is to some extent different. They all have different weather patterns and climate. The soils themselves are very different. The fertilizer sources that are available vary dramatically. And hopefully if there's manure available or other waste that can be added to soil fertility, they're being used in the mix as well. So really what we have to do is provide decision-making tools that allow farmers to take in the data that's available to them and the knowledge and be able to make good science-based decisions so that they can get their fertilizer decisions right. In the end, if we don't give farmers the tools to be able to adapt, the continual change that's going to be required through changing climate and is going to be very difficult. And so this is a key part of getting it right. So I think I'll let it go there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Clyde, for identifying the link there between the science and then the adoption through a program such as the 4 Rs. And we're hearing now some quite significant numbers, you know, real emissions reductions through the agricultural system. And I guess that's the philosophy of WBCSD's Climate Smart Agriculture Group and indeed the Global Agribusiness Alliance, is that we see agriculture as a solution to climate change. Obviously we have a lot to do, but I think working with the private sector, as identified by Bruce, we can start to implement those solutions at scale. So we've looked at the production side from a farmer's perspective. We're going to now look at the other end of the chain, and that's on the consumption side. So what does a big brand think about when it's looking at emissions through its value chain? So I'd like to welcome Diane Holdorf, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Kellogg, to share her insight.
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about why these things matter as a big branded company like the Kellogg Company. We're a business that relies on ingredients. And so without a robust, healthy food system that is resilient and adaptive in the face of climate change, we don't have a business. And that is something that matters a lot to us, but equally, you know, it really matters even more to the farming communities from whom we're sourcing our ingredients around the world. So as we looked as an organization on what were our biggest risks, where were the biggest needs for us to focus our work in the face of climate change and the work that we do at the intersection of hunger and climate change and healthy food systems, it was clearly back at the farm. And this was actually challenging for us as a business because we don't own farms. We're not vertically integrated. We're working with millers and other suppliers. So for us to map back our global ingredient chain, because we are making food around the world and selling food around the world and often buying those ingredients as close to our operations as possible. which is usually, we can usually do with corn and rice, for example, and it's a little harder with things like rice and cocoa and other ingredients. But it meant that we needed to understand what was happening back where those roots are in the ground, and what role might we play as a big brand and a big company whose expertise, frankly, is not in agriculture, not in inputs and fertilizer. What role should we play in being able to provide the type of opportunity and support that would turn those risks into ones that could be mitigated and still support the livelihoods of the people back at the farm? So as a company, we took a couple of different approaches to this. We started off, it was important for us that everything that we do is based not just in what's most material for us, but also based in science. We set science-based targets that we announced at COP21 in Paris for Scope 1 and Scope 2 to continue the work that we're doing in our own operations, where we're in our second generation of commitments now, and with those announcements, set those targets out to 2050 in support of the NDCs and the governments that were there. But also, really importantly, and frankly quite challenging, in Scope 3 in our total value chain and supply base. And that was something that we really weren't sure how we were going to get after, and we knew that it would need to be done in partnership with others. And this concept of the work being led within WBCSD from a business standpoint around climate-smart agriculture is something that was actually critically important to us, because while obviously we want to be playing a part in helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture, and therefore in our own Scope 3 emissions, what was even more important to us within that framework is that it focuses first and foremost on yields and resilience and adaptation in the face of climate change for farmers and farming communities. So we've got a commitment to support 500,000 farmers around the world in adopting climate-smart agricultural practices. We do work through our supply base each year to understand through grower surveys what are the practices on the ground from both an environmental standpoint and, often importantly, a social standpoint as well, for where the biggest opportunities are, as Bruce and Hayden both have referred to. These are complex systems, so changes made in one area can have unintended consequences, and we wanted to make sure that we were thoughtful in our approach and understanding the nuance of the crop and the locations that we were working in. And I thought what might be most helpful for our time here this morning is if I share just a couple of quick examples that ladder primarily to those priorities that Bruce set out with the great new report that they've just launched, and one that is actually beyond that that we think holds a lot of importance and promise as well. So a couple of examples. And all of these are working together with suppliers and with partners. The first example I'll share is one on micro-irrigation. I thought that was a really interesting priority that was set out in the report there. And this actually first came to light for us when we were trying to source quinoa for Special K. A couple of years ago in the US, we wanted to create a multi-grain Special K and other foods as well. And we wanted to be able to source quinoa and ensure that we were doing it in a responsible way. And as we started working with our suppliers and other partners on the ground, we realized that, and started speaking with the farmers in these high Altano Plain region of Bolivia, these were communities that weren't even on the electrical grid, but we're already talking about the risks of climate change. They were facing big challenges in rain variation. And as they were planting their quinoa crops, the rains were not coming at the right time, but not only due to altitude, but also because of not being on an electrical grid, they had very limited options. So in working together with our supplier, Andean Naturals, who's actually a B Corp, something that we thought was quite unusual in our supply base, but a variety of other partners as well, we, through Special K and Akashi brands, were able to bring solar power to these communities. That had the opportunity for them to then put micro-irrigation into place, which meant that they were no longer really facing the same risks of weather pattern changes and rain coming, to be able to actually intensify the agriculture on their land. That meant that they didn't need to clear more land, which is quite fragile at that altitude, to try to increase their yields. They were able to increase their yields on the land they already had. But interestingly, it had some other major benefits as well. These were communities where you know, the majority of the work had to be done during daylight hours. And so as you start to extend the day through the use of electricity in homes, children actually could stay home during the week because they could come home and do their schoolwork at home. They didn't have to live in the closest town. So that's just one example of some of the additional benefits that taking these kinds of approaches can have in these communities. Another example I'll talk about is rice. Rice is an incredibly important crop for us. We source rice in each of the major rice-growing regions of the world. And we've been working with suppliers and with farmers to move to alternative wet-dry. And anybody who's had the opportunity to work with farmers on these knows that it's an incredible risk, frankly, for farmers to move into these kinds of practices, particularly when, for generations or as far back as they can remember, that they've had to have flooded fields to grow their rice and have their best yields. And I'll use actually an example here in Europe, where we worked with farm growers in Spain in the Delta del Ebro region, which is, despite being next to a UNESCO World Heritage Site for water, is really struggling with water and salination levels, and worked with them to adopt alternative wet-dry and actually used the Cool Farm tool to measure, which is hard to do often at the farm level, at least in our experience, outside of test plots and pilot plots, in the real growing activities. And indeed, moving to alternate wet-dry helped to reduce greenhouse gases, I think in the nature of 18 to 20% on field during the growing cycle. But what really surprised us is we went back and measured post-harvest. And Hayden, I think it was you who spoke to the fact that leaving that crop residue in the field, particularly if it's flooded, is one of the highest impacts of greenhouse gas emissions from rice growing, actually more so than the growing process itself quite often. And by changing that to a dry and just soil moist process, we received some incredibly high greenhouse gas emission reductions, upward of 70%. Kind of shocked. We wanted to go back and do it again to make sure we were actually getting the right readings for that. And it's that kind of stuff that we want to look to be able to then leverage and scale into other regions where we can hopefully use relatively simple tools. Multi-cropping, particularly from a nutrition standpoint, not just from a greenhouse gas standpoint, is increasingly important. And we've got an example where we were working together with partners like TechnoServe and the Indian government's work in farmer cooperative teams to introduce not only improved wheat growing practices in a region of India where it's predominantly women who are working the fields, but also to bring a multi-cropping approach to that for introducing beans, a variety of 2 or 3 actually different types of beans that bring additional protein into their diet and bring some diversification into what they can sell at the local market. Along with the agricultural practices for how to increase the improve the growing practices and increase their wheat yields, they actually then had improved nutritional benefits and other cropping benefits in their own farm, and they didn't have to try to find access to fertilizer inputs. Women often don't actually even have the access to finance or training to use fertilizer inputs, and here it was frankly outside of their cost structure to be able to do that, and so it increased the nitrogen retention in their soils as well, which of course then helped their wheat yields. So 3 quick examples speaking to 3 of the priorities that Bruce and the report that was just shared that was laid out. And I'll leave you with one last one that falls outside of that, but that we're trying to get better quantification on because we think it's so critically important, and that is addressing food loss and waste post-harvest at the farm level. And we are working in a couple of different places on improving, or shall I say, decreasing post-harvest loss, because anything that's harvested and then doesn't actually get used and sold first and used as food is really a tremendously wasteful use and contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. We're working in a couple of examples. I'll share one in the Philippines, again on rice, where they were laying the rice out to dry post hulling, and that was leading to a lot of risk due to weather and rain. And by introducing solar bubble drying, which we actually did together with Erie, one of the International Rice Research Institute, had some huge improvements there. We've seen other improvements in maize in Mexico, working together with CIMMYT, and then in Bangladesh on potatoes as well. And we think that post-harvest loss reduction is a critically important factor for all of us to be focused on in this space from an innovation and technology standpoint as well. So with that, I'll pass with a couple of examples and look forward to the continued discussion.
Thanks, Diane, for those examples and very real ones that link, directly to the top 10 best bets in mitigation and adaptation. And we're touching now a little bit more on the social side of innovation, and we're going to explore the social themes a little bit more in the next half of this discussion. But now we're going to move into another area of innovation, innovations in markets and innovations in finance. So I'm looking at the audience now, and I know a couple of people in the audience. So raise your hand if you've ever bought and sold agricultural carbon. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, good. Well, we've got a couple of examples of this, and we have Matthew Warnken from Corporate Carbon, who's going to share the experience of working in the Australian marketplace.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon, everybody. It's echo Diane's comments in terms of great to see you here on a wet afternoon in Bonn. And it's really great to be on a panel and hearing those stories and examples of projects that are delivering far and above greenhouse gas mitigation outcomes than what had previously been thought. I always find that so inspiring and a great antidote to a lot of negativity that often surrounds some of the discussion around dealing with the challenges of global warming. I'm Managing Director of Corporate Carbon. We are a project developer and aggregator under the Australian Emission Reduction Fund program. And in terms of my remarks, I'd like to make 3 rounds of comments, each with three points, covering off the potential that we're involved in terms of agriculture, and that's soil organic carbon. Look at the innovation requirements that we are involved with, and then some of the priority areas that we see for action. But then first, just as I was catching the train from Cologne Haupt to Bahnhof into Bonn, I was thinking about why am I so optimistic about the potential of soil organic carbon? And three things. One, it does deliver that double dividend of improved business outcomes, that's improved yields, while also delivering that improved environmental outcome in terms of soil health. Secondly, it also delivers both mitigation and adaptation. Whether one's a co-benefit of the other, I'll leave that to some of the academic arguments. But delivering that soil carbon sink as well as improved drought resistance becomes a fundamental value in engaging with soil organic carbon. And then thirdly, it's scalable at a level that makes it significant to not only national NDCs, but also to achieving abatement that is significant at that gigaton, at that international sort of wedge level. And it's without trade-offs that we see with some of the other potential land sector programs. We're not talking about carbon sinks versus food production. It's both. It's that the power of and. It's sequestration and improved agricultural activity, which is so important. So these factors combine to present a really, in my opinion, a powerful lever that can be used to draw down carbon dioxide concentrations to a safe climate level. So then in terms of the innovation we're involved in, 3 things again. Measurement, verification, reporting, I think Hayden picked up on that. The mechanism, how do you actually build soil organic carbon, and then the funding model. So then that truism that you can't manage what you can't measure, it's a truism, because it's actually true. So that measuring your soil organic carbon levels, especially if you're going to be trading soil organic carbon credits, is fundamental. And under the Australian Emissions Reduction Fund, we have a regulatory instrument that sets out the requirements for measurement that is auditable, and in my understanding is the only program worldwide that is auditable to a reasonable assurance level. So it's pretty much the highest level of audit. So that that sets out the basis for creating carbon credits. It also sets out the basis for complying with the regulatory program. And one of the great things that we were able to achieve working with the Australian government is it wasn't prescriptive. So the integrity of the scheme is the baseline measurement. You measure your soil organic carbon stocks at the start of your project, implement your project mechanism, not prescriptive as to which route or what activity you choose to go about building your soil organic carbon, but then measure your subsequent sampling rounds. And all things being equal, a lot of bureaucracy and red tape and calculations in the meantime, but you credit the difference. And then that gives farmers, project developers, the ability to follow their own pathway in building soil organic carbon, getting those carbon credits. So to date, in Australia, we've baselined under that program around about 20,000 hectares. We're gearing up to develop the capacity to do 10 times that amount this next year. We do the top 30 centimetres, and then we also go down to a metre. And what we're also measuring is not just soil organic carbon, but the full range of nutrients. I'm not a soil technician, I'm far from being a farmer, but we recognise that important in terms of plant nutrition, grazing nutrition, being able to measure that full range of nutrients to be able to develop part of your program. It's not just soil organic carbon, you're picking up on those other nutrients. And what we're doing is effectively mapping the underground resource. It's a lot of the time you don't see the bottom 1 metre of soil because not many people spend a lot of time digging down that deep. So that's the measurement, the verification reporting, which is in place, which is a critical element to unlocking this innovation. So then secondly, the mechanism. How do you go about building soil organic carbon? And what we, from a commercial perspective, is what we're looking for is that breakthrough potential. So not the incremental improvement, although that is important, but coming from that, where's that commercial driver, is where is that breakthrough performance. And where we've landed on is pasture cropping in grazing systems or cover cropping, so planting additional seeds over the top of your pastures in the downtime. So for example, planting a winter crop in a pasture system that's primarily salmon driven to then get that additional feed, additional 50 to 75% of feed that then drives from the commercial perspective, closing feed gaps and farmers not having to bring in as much food. We've also landed on a specific technology, a strain-based technology. It's called SoilKey. It's a combination cultivation, aeration and seeding machine. And the advantage of this is it makes the activity programmable. So we're not asking a lot for farmers in terms of how they go about doing this activity. Here's the technology, here's the approach, here's the basis. And our goal in driving and running these programs is we're looking for 25 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare per annum out of the top 30 centimetres level, which corresponds to around about 1% increase over a 5-year period in that top 30 centimetres level. And that we do see as having that breakthrough potential. So then the third thing comes to the funding model, because obviously farmers aren't going to do things unless it makes commercial sense. As a company, we have contracts to deliver carbon credits to the Australian government of around about $600 million. $200 million, or roughly a third of that, is related to soil carbon projects. So we will be paying farmers to build their soil organic carbon levels. In fact, we've already started. We have a commercial incentive because the better the farmers do at building soil carbon, the better that we do as a company. So that's given us the impetus to invest in the systems to allow the participation with the farmers. So we look at those participation models, take away the headaches of engaging with a regulated scheme, and make it easier for them to start mapping their soils. And what we see, the commercial alignment is really about the main driver here, not being so much the carbon credits, but the agricultural benefit. What the carbon credits does is it gives us a handy scorecard in terms of how do you keep track as to how the program is or how the mechanism is going, and an opportunity to cut through and talk to farmers in terms of here's a new range of things to integrate into their farming operation and provide an incentive to actually change those practices. So then just closing off then with 3 points in terms of priority areas for action. And we firmly believe we're at the implementation scale. Maybe it's the early stage commercialization as opposed to the full best practice, but we're past the research. We have an auditable MVR framework under that Australian project. And what that does in terms of innovation is that every project in effect becomes a research project. We're doing research in real time at an enterprise level that's comparable with every other farm that's participating in the scheme, which feeds into a whole raft of other things like big data and how you go about tracking the performance of those projects on farm. The second thing is a finance piece. So we'd say that in terms of the pipeline that we're working with is around about 1 million hectares. 100 farmers have self-selected, put up their hand saying we want to improve our farming practices. We think this should be taken into account by banks who hold the mortgages over their farms in terms of these are the farmers who are going to be improving the productivity of their farms. So the ability to access lower rates of interest all of a sudden becomes a funding pathway for farmers to engage with how you go about building the quality of that major asset, their soil. And then finally is a sort of a hybrid asset finance piece, which would allow farmers to actually acquire the technologies to implement soil organic carbon projects on their own farms. In the Australian context, so we're financing the first round of farm for soil key equipment deployment, and that's in the $1 million. We're already working on the finance package to do the next $10 million worth of soil key rollout. But to be relevant at the national level in terms of NDCs, at the international level, we're looking as to where do we get the $100 million to roll these programs and machines out amongst farms, and that is like working in terms of how do you monetize some of that the carbon credits on a forward trade to be able to fast track that program. And that's really just taking a microcosm look in terms of what we would be doing in Australia, let alone expanding that kind of approach or technology internationally. So thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to the rest of the panel discussion.
Thanks very much, Matthew. And did I get the number right here? 25 tonnes per hectare per annum. Yep. So if we're at say a $20 price bracket there, then the farmer or the grazier would be earning around $500 per hectare, which would be a fairly good commercial return in many circumstances, I would certainly think. And what I like about this is that the innovation isn't necessarily coming from research organisations or corporates involved in carbon trading. That the innovation is being driven from the farmer. We're scaling up things like pasture cropping and those practices that farmers, say 20 or 30 years ago, low and no-till type practices, they were seen as being rather radical, and now these are being seen as the norm. And hopefully these radical ideas as they are now, with finance, with scale, with the support of the large retailers, we can really transform the agricultural sector and, as I say, become a solution to climate change rather than being seen as a major emitter. So I'd like to turn now to Bernard Stormier of Yara to talk about the cutting-edge products that his company is incorporating.
Thank you, Matthew. And I have to say, I think this is really exciting. And take a minute to pause to consider the aspect of innovation in itself. I think if you look at the Fortune 500 list, how will that look like in 20 years' time? It will probably look very different, because in a world post the Paris Agreement, with the universal picking up of the SDGs, we as companies really need to drive deep innovation in order to have future-fit strategies. And we need even to be willing to radically change our business models if that is what is needed to compete in a world that is going to deliver on the Paris Agreement and on the SDGs. And we were founded 100 years ago, well, 112 years ago actually, in Norway, and we are now a global leading fertilizer company. And I just have to say that our business model is clearly evolving. It is not anymore about a volumes price game. It's about redefining your strategies to be farmer-centric. So we don't necessarily want to sell the maximum volumes of fertilizer to the individual farmer, but we want to work together with the farmer to help them optimize the return on investment into our products. So this means working on higher quality products, working with technology development, and doing scientifically based research in the fields in order to support the farmers in making the right decisions for their operations. So I'll give you a couple of examples on how we are working to do that. And it's incredibly important that we meet the farmers where they are at. So I'm going to share with you an example on precision farming for sub-Saharan smallholders. So this is a precision farming tool that we help farmers use in Africa. So how do we do that? So we tell the farmers that when they plant their maize seeds, they shall put fertilizer this deep into the soil when they plant their maize seeds. And then we ask them to use another quite interesting precision farming tool. It's the bottle cap of a bottle of water. Because you need 2 scoops of fertilizer for 2 maize seeds. And that gives you the right dosage for the maize, and then of course a dedicated quality of fertilizer for the maize crop. And then we teach them that they should also do top dressing. So once the maize is about hip high, they should apply another solar cap per plant of maize, but the hand width apart from the plant itself. So that gives you the optimal return on investment for the smallholder farmer. So this is precision farming technology at a very, very basic level, learning them, training the farmers to use the products in a way that maximizes the uptake into the maize of the fertilizer. So reducing losses to the environment and also benefiting the farmer by having more returns on their investment into the fertilizer product. But that's the African context, it's the smallholder world. We also need to talk about how we work with the large-scale farmers, because the 10% largest land holders operate more than 80% of the farmland worldwide. So we have developed precision farming technology to support the farmers. One example is an N sensor, which is a tool that sits on top of the tractor, and the farmer can scan the yields, and this tool measures the nitrogen uptake in the crop and automatically adjusts the dosage of fertilizer applied according to the need of the crop. So this typically reduces the farmer's consumption of fertilizer by up to 10 to 15%. And it typically also increases the yield for the farmer by some 5, 6, 7%. So why on earth would we develop a technology that helps the farmer to reduce the consumption of our products? This is about developing the business model. This is about being farmer-centric. So this is about working with the farmer to make them maximize the return on investment by working with us. It's not about volumes, it's about building profit for the farmer in such a way that optimizes both the economic but also the environmental performance of the farming operation. I'd just like to add one more example to this short list. We are in the process of developing and rolling out into the market something that's called a crop water sensor. And basically, it's a magnet that sits on the leaf, and it measures the blood pressure, so to speak, of the crop. So this is a non-invasive measurement of the crop's need for water. So this technology can tell you exactly when your crops need irrigation. And this is connected through a Wi-Fi system, and it can be operated over the internet. So this speaks for the next generation of farmers. You can sit with your laptop on the beach, and you can monitor your crops, and you can operate your irrigation system, and you connect it to weather forecasts. So if you see, well, my crops are thirsty, but there's some rain coming, so I'll just hold off. Or you can intentionally dry out your crops to induce growth. So it's a very high-tech solution for how you can irrigate, and we're working on integrating water-soluble fertilizer into such systems. Again, typically in a fairly advanced irrigation system, we can help the farmers reduce water consumption by some 20% or even more. And the farmers typically also get higher yields and better quality of the crops by using this technology. So it's being field tested in South Africa these days. It's going to be introduced to Californian farmers. It's now ready to use for olives and citrus, but we are also looking at other crops. So looking forward for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard. And it sounds to me like the model you have is a disruptive model, to use that common parlance for the way in which modern business operates. We're now going to continue on the theme of connectivity with farmers, and many corporates have the opportunity to touch the farm gate. And I'd like to introduce now Gabriela Burian from Monsanto, who has a very innovative program of working with the farmers behind the farm gate.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us. Then, talking a little bit about Monsanto is important to frame, because we know there is always questions. We are more than GMO. GMO is one piece, but we are going to this system transformation. Although we believe GMO would be an important part, we understand that not all the regions are understanding and are ready. What's a little bit different than the pharmaceutical, for instance, where they have insulin thanks to GMO. In agriculture, we are facing a lot of challenges in terms of this discussion. Then we are continuing to do this transformation, still offering GMOs where farmers are interested and the society is ready for, but going to ag-biologicals and the precision agriculture in helping to face those challenges that farmers are facing, and our society needs to be prepared. One interesting point is when I'm Brazilian, originally, born in France, but Brazilian, and 5 years ago, Monsanto, the big headquarter American company, landed in Brazil and invited me to come over to United States, to Missouri. And their main point was we were doing in Brazil a good engagement process. And Monsanto was, for the first time ever, recognized as a region doing a good engagement process. This was, for me, 5 years ago, it was like, wow. My English is my third language. It was not part of my plans to move to United States, Europe perhaps, but United States not so much. My husband was working, kids very well in the school. I was good in the market, the sustainability market in Brazil. I was someone, and it was a big challenge. Brazil back then was very good, not so like today, but 5 years ago it was really great. Then in fact, our family took a while to waiting out the points. The first reaction was, wow, sounds a little bit terrifying, move to a country that I don't understand, I really don't even were ready to connect very well. But in the other side, it was a good opportunity for my kids. Back then, they were like 12 and 7 years old, for my family to face a challenge. That was, how can we better connect? Then a little bit different than Kellogg's that has been always connected to consumers. Monsanto was not at all connected to consumers. They were investing zero in marketing back then, zero. There was no communication team. They invest $1 billion per year in research. And their main mindset, then when I moved to the United States 5 years ago, I started to understand. They are based in Missouri. Missouri is the show-me state, very farmers-oriented, like a bubble in this planet. They really don't understand what's happening and all those questions, etc. Then the engagement, now I'm responsible globally for engagement, And I used to say the engagement in St. Louis is really a challenge because there is no one to engage in St. Louis. My son, when we arrived, he was like, where are the people here? We used to live in São Paulo, where you have people all the time with you. In St. Louis, there is no. I ride my bike in the sidewalk because there is no people in the sidewalk. And the front desk first day, he was like, bike? Where you should park the bike? Not sure. We don't have rules for bikes here. Then it's really a different country, St. Louis, Missouri. Then I start, for me, I'm still learning a lot of different languages. And back then, what was interesting for me was my first suggestion, and this was the only thing that I negotiated with Monsanto was, okay, I move, but we need to join the World Business Council. This was 5 years ago. All our competitors were already in the World Business Council. Monsanto was like, okay, we are not so aware. Then we moved, and 5 years ago, we joined the World Business Council, starting the discussion about key topics, such as climate change. Back to the company, what was interesting to see was all the fellows and the researchers were like very aware about climate change, of course. But their reaction was like, Gabriela, we need to take care because farmers don't like to talk about this. I'm like, this is interesting, but we need to let them know that we need to talk and we need to act. And one point that I believe it shows a little bit how this region is, when we joined the World Business Council, then first point, I was very new in US. My communicators team arrived, Gabriela, we are receiving letters from farmers, our customers, asking if we are joining the United Nations. Seriously, this was their point. And if we are joining the Agenda 21, I was like, oh my God. Because we were joining the World Business Council. Then it was a lot about engagement there and dialogue about what's happening in the world, what's United Nations. Unfortunately, we cannot join United Nations, but everything that we are doing and start to connect a little bit the dots. Then what was very interesting was when we started the discussion about climate with the World Business Council, there was this big journey that the World Business Council was preparing from Peru to Paris. Some of you probably remember this. Back then, it was the Low Carbon Technology Partnership Initiatives, and agriculture was not part of that. This was all technologies. Then it was solutions for climate. And with the World Business Council, and Forest also was not there, with the World Business Council, we start this dialogue. We want to be part of the discussion. Agriculture is part of the solution. We have, in fact, we can touch all the SDGs, and we have solutions, and we need to discuss. Then together with our group, our great group, we start to put together the Climate Smart Agriculture, part of the Low Carbon Technology Partnership Initiative. And we launched together a big group in 2015 in Paris. What is interesting to remember is the report, and it's online, that is there. I use this as a Bible because there is a table prepared by the IPCC, 2014, table 11.2. But if you Google Climate Smart Agriculture, LCTPI, you find this report. It is our first report. It was our compass. And back then at the page 40, there is this table related to the IPCC that is how can we achieve the 1.6 gigatons that agriculture can commit to reduce CO2? And on top of that, 2.1 that's related to stop deforestation. If you look at this table, there is everything related to soil carbon, better system management, precision agriculture, biotechnology is there too. And all those numbers, if you add those numbers together, it's 1.6 gigaton, adding to the no deforestation, 2.1, you have 3.7, that is our goal. And what's beautiful related to this is we are the second, just following. The only one that's in front of us is renewables, of course. And we can argue that agriculture is also connected to them. But anyway, we are the second sector responsible for biggest commitment related to reducing CO2 by 2030. We are together. And we did this together with CGIAR, together with many nonprofits, our plan. How can we make sure we'll be addressing this? Then this is how we have been operating in 5 key geographies in the world together, always together, knowing that's not easy. A lot of people, when they start this process, they are like, oh, big companies, etc. We are really working on the ground with people that are in the regions. Then the way we put together those 5 key geographies in the world was defining where NDCs are priority in terms of agriculture, second, business, because we are not philanthropic, it's for business solutions, and third point is finance, where there is interest related to finance. And then in those 5 geographies, we have 4 action areas. And in each one of those areas, we have examples. We all are working together. Then first action area that I love is resilience, and Diana always mentioned resilience very well to relate to livelihoods, etc. And in the resilience, what's interesting to mention is we have some solutions coming to the growers that will help them to better produce and better adapt to what they need, making sure they will survive to all those crises that are there. Then, in terms of practical examples, in Brazil, we are helping in the resilience part to integrate crop, livestock, and forests, because many areas, this is how they can survive. Brazil needs to preserve the forest for us all in the society. And a lot of growers are like, why I need to preserve 20% or 35% or even 80% of my own land for the rest of the world? Then there is a big piece that we are missing, that's carbon pricing, of course. Then second point is the internal carbon pricing. Monsanto internalized this, and we have an internal carbon pricing that is $51 per ton. Why we did that? Because this helps us to deliver what are the products that the farms need to make sure we'll be reducing CO2. Third point, monitoring. Then back in 2015, in Paris, the Ag Day, December 1st, we were there launching our climate smart agriculture, and knowing that we are Monsanto, we need to have actions. We launched also our carbon neutral commitment. That is by 2021, we will become carbon neutral in our own operations and helping also farmers to adopt techniques that can help to sequester carbon sink. Then one big piece related to this, that is go to our second point related to action area. First one is resilience, second point is finance, is how can we make sure this will be interesting for the farmers. Then in United States, we are establishing a collaborative together with USDA and key experts. We put there $1.6 million in order to establish the framework that Australia is already working. Then we are starting to work on that regard in United States too. Third point is monitoring. Then in terms of monitoring, we have CGIAR also, of course, working. And in Brazil, we are working with Embrapa in order to make sure we will have this process adapted to the country. And finally, the final one that I love, that is stop deforestation. That is crucial. In fact, it's half of what we need to deliver by 2030. As of today, the way we have been working is we are advancing a partnership that we used to have with Conservation International, now to a big collaboration. Then this has governments, has companies, has other nonprofits. It's called globally the Good Grow Partnership, and in Brazil it's 2020, Mato Piba, etc. And in Mato Piba, that's a big region where we have the social challenge. We also need to stop deforestation to make sure people are not advancing, even sometimes in the legal possibility. There are farms and there are areas that can still be deforested. However, we cannot afford it as a society. Who will pay the price? This is what we are discussing together with many stakeholders, and this is the challenge and the opportunity that we all face together. It's beautiful, it's awesome, but we really cannot afford to have paradigms thinking that they cannot participate and others cannot participate. We need to open our hearts and think together, how can we face and deliver solutions that our kids deserve? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriella, for sharing the insights and indeed your own journey to this point. And I think what the message is around innovation is none of this happens in a vacuum. We need farmers, we need to work through our supply chains, and we need to support local action. And whilst COP23 has been going on, Landcare, an organisation that actually originated in Australia and is quite active in New Zealand, in about 16 countries. WBCSD and the GAA has sponsored Landcare at this time in Nagoya. They're meeting at this time, and they've asked us to read the Nagoya Declaration. May I ask someone take a picture of us reading the Nagoya Declaration, because it talks to the need for social infrastructure to be able to deliver on this innovation and to have investments here. So as I said, Landcare practitioners from 11 countries have met in Nagoya, and they determined that Landcare values and principles, which is farmer-led, could contribute significantly to grassroots activities for sustainable agriculture, climate adaptation and mitigation, social and environmental well-being, which we've discussed here on the panel, and could therefore contribute significantly to the achievement of the SDGs. All of this is possible through a network. This is farmer-to-farmer networks which facilitate partnerships, collaboration and the provision of resources to deliver capacity at a local, a regional, national and indeed a global level. And it's models like Landcare that deliver and develop this kind of network. So the recommendation from Nagoya is that we make more investment in social infrastructure and on-ground action through Landcare and farmers to achieve the NDCs for mitigation and adaptation. So through this technological discussion, we mustn't forget the social side, and I think that came through very well with all of our speakers here. So at this point, given we only have a few minutes left, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. So I'm going to take 3 questions. We'll see what the responses are to those questions and then throw those to the panel. If you have a question that's to be directed to a member of the panel, please say so. And when you ask your question, please could you state who you are and the name of your organisation, please. So who has the gentleman in the centre here, first with the hand up.
My name is John Katazeski. I work with Winrock International. And I guess this question is first for Matthew, but I think other panelists might comment on it. You made one very interesting comment to me where you differentiated between how much of the benefits could be achieved from productivity increases versus how much of the benefit could be achieved from absolute reductions in emissions. And maybe I have my Matthews wrong, because I was thinking of... Yes, it was Hayden, I'm sorry. And so I was very interested in how that number was calculated, because you said you thought 20 to 40% could come from productivity gains and a lesser percentage. And so that's, like, they're very important numbers, and they have very important implications for measurement and setting baselines, depending upon whether you're trying to do intensity-based metrics from productivity increases or absolute reduction emissions, which tend to be land area based.
Good. Gentleman in the front here, Tony.
Tony Shansonis, also with WBCSD. There's been a lot of talk through some of the events about how to obviously scale up these initiatives, and there were so many fantastic examples that the panel gave, some of which were still at more testing and experimental stage, and some of which had been scaled up. At other events, there's also been talk about the challenge of how to finance that, both from the perspective of getting the volume of finance that we know needs to come from the private sector, and the speed of financing that. And I know there was another event where Diane, also you mentioned the difficulty of that finance coming quickly. I was wondering a question for anyone on the panel about their views on how you can get the private sector to both provide more volume of finance and speed of finance to help get these initiatives to the scale we need them to reach in order to meet some of these mitigation and adaptation targets. Thanks.
Excellent. And we can take a final question. Danush in the front here. We'll take the lady's question there. We should make sure that we are balanced in the questions as well as the presenters.
Kia ora, my name is Alicia Vigezra. I'm from the New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries. So I've got a background in government work, so it was really interesting to hear some of the commercial perspectives. And my question is for Fertiliser Canada and Yara. And it's a bit simplistic and could be a bit reductionist, but I'm quite interested to hear your views on this. So you both talked about sort of not necessarily trying to maximise volume of fertiliser to farmers, but maximising the return on investment for farmers and working with farmers for sort of precision inputs of fertiliser to reduce environmental impact. I'm just trying to think of, from a commercial bottom line point of view, I mean, selling potentially not maximising volume might affect the commercial bottom line negatively. I was just wondering if you could unpack a little bit more about the commercial drivers and whether it's just a corporate social responsibility perspective from you, or whether there are other commercial benefits. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Alicia. Okay, so the questions are that productivity and carbon question for Hayden. We have the scale up and finance, the role of the private sector, and other views on finance for anyone on the panel. And then Alicia's question directed to the fertiliser companies and representatives here today. So Hayden, may I ask you to start with the responses, please?
Thank you for the question. It's always a danger when you quote a number that, there's always room for interpretation. But I'll try and explain quickly what that analysis was. As you can imagine, with anything projecting forward in agriculture, you have a lot of uncertainty in terms of demand for products and mitigation potential and cost and everything else. But basically, you had 3 global models that were run out to the future, and they analysed effectively what reductions below baseline per annum would need to be made in the agriculture sector to be consistent with a world achieving a 2-degree maximum warming, i.e. the Paris Agreement. And that is, of course, taking into account the efforts expected from other sectors, all right? Because if others did less, you would expect more from ag. So some decisions were taken. Nonetheless, the average of the 3 models said that by 2030, per year, the agricultural sector would need to reduce its emissions by 1 gigatonne below that baseline. Now, important to clarify, this is emissions reductions, okay? So you're talking about the non-CO2 greenhouse gases from the agricultural sector that we define in the IPCC reporting. So livestock emissions, rice emissions, nitrous oxide emissions from agricultural soils, etc. The analysis showed that if you adopted fully, which never happens, globally, the best practices that could be modelled in these models, you could achieve only between 21 and 40% of that required 1 gigatonne per year in 2030. So you can debate the numbers, but that tells you 2 things broadly. You need more options, more innovation, and you need to include the carbon sequestration side. And as we've heard from colleagues on this panel, there's a huge potential to store carbon in our soils and in our biomass through improved practices. So that's the kind of general message from that. We can't get there by BAU. We need to factor in sequestration, and there's a lot of effort going on to do that. And we need a significant level of investment and innovation to create more options for farmers. On your point around productivity, absolute reductions, etc. So I guess what appeals to farmers is emissions per unit product, because that's their world of yields, profit, productivity, efficiency. By taking that approach in a mitigation context, doesn't necessarily mean you're not reducing absolute emissions. And it depends on the situation, the context, it depends on the systems, it depends on the level of productivity at the baseline versus the future state. And there has been work done by FAO that shows in some systems by promoting best practices, you achieve significant reductions in emissions per unit product, but you can also achieve reductions in absolute terms in those contexts as well. In the livestock sector in particular, there are opportunities simply by managing the herds better in terms of animal husbandry, health, and then producing more per animal rather than increasing the animal numbers. You can make a significant impact in absolute emissions by taking effectively an efficiency approach. So it's not kind of binary either or, depends on the situation.
Thank you, Hayden. This is a question that wasn't directed to anyone, Tony. It was an open panel question to discuss scaling up finance and the role of the private sector.
I can give some thoughts because we have been working a lot on this action area. Then it's important. In fact, one piece that our group has been doing as a whole, in fact, is bringing more finance institutions to our climate smart agriculture. We were successful to have Hubble Bank, then Hubble Bank did join beginning of the year. We are still working to have more institutions. Our main idea is farmers really need more low carbon finance opportunities. In Brazil, there is a good example. The government is doing a project related to finance for low carbon agriculture. However, there is still bottlenecks, and we are working to make sure there is a guide and farmers can better understand how to use the full process. But answering the question, the main idea is really making sure finance institutions will be changing, because now they are not offering finance opportunities for farmers for low carbon agriculture. Still, they are working in the old level. Then what we are trying to do is moving this.
I'll make another, some comments probably at the practitioner level, so if anyone's got finance, we'd be happy to talk to you, because we're actively looking for those financing opportunities. And as a company, we had to go through a whole bunch of gymnastics to be able to get in a position to get $1 million worth of finance, which is off our balance sheet, and came via securing a $10 million facility with one of the Australian banks. You might know Macquarie Bank, but that was to buy farmland for native, sorry, not farmland, it was to buy native regeneration forest land. So as a company, we own 130,000 hectares of native forest regeneration. That's given us a balance sheet based on the carbon credit yield from that, which then has led us to allow the bank to take a bit more risk on us as a company and on the kind of projects that we're working with, and that leads to the next $1 million. So that's one of those challenges in terms of the risk profile and being able to actually monetize the carbon credits, because everyone talks about greenhouse gas reductions, and that's nice, but to actually make it bankable is the real challenge. And it was actually one of the reasons why I chose the name Corporate Carbon when I founded the company 7 years ago, was to make the carbon bankable, because if you can't make the carbon bankable, you can't actually use it to get finance. So what we hope to do is to concentrate on what can be done. Let's get the next deal done, because then like proliferation of windmills, you need to get one windmill up, and then there's more, and then all of a sudden 20 years later there's a beautiful landscape of windmills. So it really is focusing on where that next deal is, and then doing the work that can be done just to get that bedded in, to allow financial institutions comfortable with the concept of taking on carbon finance at that sort of micro level. This isn't the sort of big billion-dollar climate change funds. This is actually dollars to get projects done on the ground, which is obviously my level of interest.
Okay, Hayden, briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a connection to the policy dimension here. And Bruce, you mentioned in your presentation around how important that policy enabling environment is. Specifically with respect to carbon finance, I just want to highlight the fundamental importance of the public investment that has occurred. Take Australia for an example, in the national reporting system. That creates the possibility for companies like Matthew's to actually have a business. You talked about a high-quality regulated scheme, assurances, bankable carbon credits. None of that is possible without MRV. And the Australian government, in terms of their land use monitoring, etc., put a huge investment into that, into the methodologies, and that creates the business opportunity. Right. So this is where public and private sector is absolutely crucial to work together. And having these national systems with a high level of quality in terms of the information then provides the opportunity for the scaling out. It provides the opportunity for aggregating smallholders into large projects. And none of that is possible without that public dimension. Thank you.
And I think that's a very important point. Why should it be that only Canadian farmers or Australian farmers or New Zealand farmers should get money for carbon? This should be something that we're able to do right throughout developing countries that have also indicated that they would like agriculture as part of their NDCs for adaptation and mitigation, and that's one of the missions of climate smart agriculture, is to provide some of these financial opportunities through carbon markets. The fertiliser industry is involved in carbon markets as well, of course, and we're now going to look at the last question, which was the return on investment versus selling on volume. So a couple of quick comments from our fertiliser colleagues.
Thanks for that question, and it's really straightforward. This is a commercial strategy, really, because if the farmers move from using basic commodities into better performing, more tailored products, these products come with a price premium. So it's actually a profitable business case for us in working with the farmers in this way. So, but we would really like to see also climate change become part of the competition. We would love to compete on carbon footprints in the market. That's not yet the case, but we hope to get there at some point.
Yeah, please, Claude.
Yeah, and so I think that fertilizer companies that sell profitability to farmers rather than fertilizer to farmers, as Yara is, are going to prosper longer term. Just to comment on a couple of other quick points. One is unit of production. You know, we have to measure our emissions on by kilogram of grain or oilseeds that we're producing. I think one of the dangerous comments or concepts in the debate for agriculture is the idea that we can grow or that we can produce more with less. In order to produce 70% more food by 2050, we are going to have to use more inputs, but the only way we can measure our progress, though, is how efficient we are in producing those kilograms of grains and oilseeds, and we're going to do it more efficiently, but there is going to be more fertilizer and inputs used to grow that much more food. And in terms of scalability, our member companies in Canada have agreed to bring 1/5 of all the farmland in Canada, which is 20 million acres, under 4R nutrient stewardship by 2020, and that would all be very climate smart agriculture. And we also have a program in development to take 4R nutrient stewardship to 120,000 smallholder farmers in 3 continents over the next 5 years. So we are trying to take this to a much larger scale beyond just pilots, but to actual production agriculture.
Thank you very much indeed, Clyde. So we're about to close this session. I'd like to reference 2 documents. First of all is the LCTPI report, which is out there and identifies all of those participants that Gabriella has mentioned in the Climate Smart Agriculture Program. The report that Danush and with Bruce has authored around the top 10 adaptation best bets. There are really nice cards outside. It'd be great to take those back to the office and share those with some of your colleagues. And please do look on the WBCSD website for CSA to see what we're doing. We'll be around here for the next couple of days, so please come and talk to us if you'd like to learn more about the CSA program. So please join me thanking our panellists. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thanks very much. 9 minutes over, that's not too bad. That's only 1 minute per person, right? We don't have anybody behind us. Oh, we don't? Ah. What? We don't have anybody following us.